The reading development in the Chinese language.
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about this before, but your son Andrew explains that your greatest accomplishment, according to him, is the profound impact that you have had on improving childhood literacy, both nationally but also abroad. He explains that this is a direct result of your lifelong devotion to hands-on reading research as a world-renowned reading specialist. Your stepdaughter, Susan, recalls her visit with you to China, where she got to see the real fruits of your work. You both visited a Chinese kindergarten to observe 2 excellent teaching using your Sun Glory books in their lessons. The children were fully engaged in discussion and on a path to becoming enthusiastic readers. Tell us more about this research in China, but also your Sun Glory, your
All right,
products.
I will. Well, there are 2 tracks of research and development in China. One is the small figure psycholinguistics, where we try to figure out how does a Chinese, for example, how does a child represent a Chinese character in his or her mind? And we're a part of the kinds of people who work on that sort of problem are psychologists as well as educators. So we develop and test ideas about Chinese children's representation of those visually complex characters. We develop and test ideas about the Chinese children's representation and learning over a period of years of the sounds of the Chinese language. We we do compare and contrast American children learning English and Chinese children learning Chinese in their development of the concept of word in their language. What are the similarities? What are the differences? All right, we've done a lot of wonderful stuff there. Now let's set all that aside. I can give you something to read. Now let's talk about book reading in China. So after 10 or 15 years working in China, it became very clear the Chinese had no tradition of reading with children when they were little. You might play intellectually stimulating games, mind-expanding games. Chinese children do, or parents do that a lot. You might ask Chinese children to learn some characters. You might start out the task of teaching them some characters, and as school has become very competitive, we now have thousands of Chinese children forced to memorize characters. Well, we thought there's another way. We mustn't forget, especially as Chinese society opens up, there's going to be more need for intrinsic motivation. We can't keep driving these children on do it because I said so. And where is a genuine interest in reading going to come from? And how can we introduce that to Chinese children? Well, we took something that we didn't create ourselves. I would have to credit New Zealand reading educators, in particular a man named Don Holdaway invented an approach to very early reading called shared book reading. And it's so commonplace in this country, it probably just sounds like an American expression, unless you know its history. At any rate, we developed a shared book reading program, first for Chinese first graders. We wrote and adapted a lot of books, illustrated them, tried them out with a couple of first grade classes, got great results on children's involvement and teacher and child enthusiasm. Frankly, not such great results on the battery of tests we were able to give. But we decided to go forward the cautious thing for a researcher to do would be, we need more research. We always need more research. That was true 10 years ago, it'll be true 10 years from now. But at some point, you've got to act. So how are we going to introduce this lovely book reading program to Chinese children? We could go sit in the Ministry of Education and find politically connected people who would arrange for us to have an audience. Probably that's not going to work. And even if it did work, what would happen then? What we're promoting is a bit different than typical Chinese philosophy about how education is supposed to work. So at just that time, the rage in China was the joint venture company. And foreign joint venture companies were known for better products, better service. If it was a joint venture, it was probably better. So we found it with a lot of difficulty. It took us some years of knocking on doors to try to raise money, try to find the right people. We finally managed to get a company going. Here's the way to get this spread widely in China. So we wrote more and more books. My wife Jana wrote a bunch of books, many of which were used to provide examples, because people we're hiring hardly knew what we were talking about. And they're supposed to make it happen in China.
Sure, sure.
So we got a company going. I think it might have been about 2003. We celebrated our 10th anniversary. My Susan went with me to China for the 10th anniversary of the company. Well, I don't have exact and accurate figures, but we've got thousands and thousands of kindergarten classrooms in China basing their emergent literacy program on shared book reading. And we are not emphasizing memorizing characters. We're emphasizing sense of story, oral language development of intrinsic motivation for reading and writing. And something really great we do is we sponsor a writing contest for 5-year-olds.
Oh.
You could go to China and go to a kindergarten classroom and see a lesson that even though you didn't speak the language, you would know it was a good lesson.
Okay,
as an
how would I know
educator.
that? Because I'm not a reading specialist. How would I know that if I went to China?
Well, you would look at involvement, and you would look, even though you couldn't quite hear what children were saying, you would be able to tell they were expressing fairly long and complicated ideas. That was not a recitation.
Sure. And then the shared reading is they're actually sitting around books together?
Well, there's a lesson with several stages and phases, which the skilled teacher, when a teacher masters the approach, they're then able to vary even further. But it would involve, but there's a book introduction, there is a small group reading, large group reading, individual reading. In China, they believe a lot in choral reading. Oh. I might not have wanted to go that way, but sure. I was swept into it.
Respect the cultural traditions, sure. That's fascinating. And why China?
It was an accident of history that I got invited to be a leader of an official delegation, one of the first, perhaps the first in education, an exchange between delegations from the U.S. to China and China to the U.S. And I'm a provincial kid, as we've already said, a provincial kid from Wisconsin. And it just floored me. Everything was so different. Then was in the early 80s. And there were no skyscrapers in Beijing or Shanghai.
Oh, wow.
There were low 19th century looking buildings. The only cars were black Russian limousines hauling officials around.
Interesting.
There were donkey carts, thousands of bicycles. Everyone looked the same. Everyone in a Mao suit. There was a variation between khaki and dark blue. Men and women.
Really interesting.
Took these pictures on the wall.
Yeah, they're fabulous.
Not during my early visits to China.
That was during your early visits?
My early visits.
Oh, is that right? Okay. So mentoring, we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I said if we would come back to it. So your granddaughter, Eliza, explains that for you, one of your greatest joys is helping your students, many of them are Chinese, to complete their research and graduate with PhDs all around the world. You solely promote education and its benefits and will help your students in any way you can. She notes that this shows how selfless you can be in your career and your deep passion for furthering the minds of others in education. Your daughter, Sarah, adds that you have truly contributed to the world, not only with your own creativity and work, but by seeking to empower those who are close to being their best, create selves, and so to contribute their own unique gifts to us. Your stepson, Michael, describes your greatest accomplishment as your development of others as well, and that by making others great, you have become great. So one common theme across all of the people with whom we spoke is the extent to which you're a great teacher, but also a great mentor. Tell us about your role, how you define your role as a mentor.
Well, I have a lot of fun as a mentor, and I'm certainly experienced. So I have graduated 63 PhDs.
Is that right?
And Jing Soon, who you spoke to or wrote to you,
Okay, yes.
is my most recent.
Okay.
Well, it's very rewarding to do this work. So I'm not just giving, but I have a lot to get emotionally. I have a lot to learn from these smart young people who may look at things a bit differently than I do, or may have studied some advanced statistics that I didn't have a chance to study,
Sure.
and they can introduce me to it. So there's much to be gained as well as something to give. And so I'm expecting with a PhD student, it may be 5 to 7 years, and I am expecting when a new student comes in to meet at least an hour a week with that student for that 5 to 7 years.
Okay, that's quite a commitment. Your former student, Dr. Gail Sinatra, described your role as the inspiration for the National Consortium for Instruction and Cognition, the NCIC, an organization founded by a group of your students. She notes that the NCIC now has an endowed Graduate Student Research Award to support future scholars. In quotes, an amazing legacy for a scholar that is unique because of its focus on mentoring the next generation of scholars through an academic family model. Tell us a bit more about the NCIC.
All right, it was founded by a half dozen of my early students, and the first meeting was a party in a hotel in Minneapolis, and then the parties got more systematic, and we still have parties.
Great.
But now we have for a number of years, maybe 30 years, I had bylaws, officers.
Oh, is that right?
Possibly this is unique in the academic world, to have an organization that has gone on since 1969. How long is that? Is that 31? Nearly 50
Almost
years.
50 years.
Almost 50 years that has had an annual, and we're just an academic family. We don't know, certainly not in education, but we have not heard in any field of study a group just like ours. So we have, at one of our meetings, we will have 3 or 4 or 5 academic generations.
Oh, fabulous.
As well as guests and others.
Sure. And it's all focused around mentoring?
Basically, yes.
Okay. And helping these other people mentor well.
Yes, that's right.
That's fabulous. Okay. All right. So
And you can see here's a
Oh, the poster?
from our 25th get-together, which might have been
1994.
1994.
Yeah, it says
yes.
1969 to 1994.